March 11, 2014, Tuesday. I remember that day down to the smallest detail, even the smell of coffee that went cold on the windowsill while I watched the city from the 5th floor. Back then, I did not know that a week later I would disappear from every radar. And a month after that, people would talk about me as the man who pulled off the impossible. My name is Artyom Koldin. I was 33 at the time. I worked as a systems engineer for a company called Tech Security, a contractor servicing the internal networks of several banks. Officially, I handled routine security audits and server maintenance. Unofficially, I knew too much about how money really worked when it existed only as digits, not in vaults. That morning began like any other. 9:20 in the morning. I entered the office. The monitors were already flickering with reports no one but me could read. The wall clock ticked loudly, each second somehow heavier than the one before. My task for the day was to check the backup system for the Nordinvest Bank archive. On paper, it was nothing special. In practice, it meant direct access to the inner transaction logs. I remember opening the first file. It contained 3 years of records, transfers, internal codes, account activities. Among the endless numbers, something caught my eye. Every 2 weeks, at the exact same hour, the system made an unauthorized call to the archive. The signal came from the same node each time, but no record of it existed in the reports. That was impossible. Either someone had infiltrated the system, or someone high above had allowed it. I marked the anomaly but did not report it. You do not reveal something like that right away. I printed the log, slipped it into a folder, and locked it in my drawer. I remember thinking, I will deal with it after lunch, but that was where it all began. That evening, March 11, I sat in my car in the office parking lot, unable to drive away. Numbers, dates, strings of data kept spinning in my head. Everything formed a pattern, but not the kind you could explain to your boss. I realized I was seeing traces of something big, too big for an ordinary engineer to understand or to survive knowing. The next day, March 12, I arrived at work earlier than usual, 7:40 in the morning. The server room was empty, the fans humming softly. I connected to the backup line, and that is when I saw something that should not have existed. On one of the drives, there was a duplicate system, a full shadow copy of the bank internal network. It was not listed in any document, identical to the main one, except there were no security logs and no access restrictions. And the strangest part, it was active. Someone had been using it, regularly but carefully. A strange feeling came over me, a mix of awe and fear. I understood that what I was looking at could make the perfect robbery possible. No guns, no alarms, no fingerprints, just numbers moving silently across servers, and then erasing themselves from history. That night, I could not sleep. The city outside went on as usual. Cars, traffic lights, the dull rhythm of life. But in my head, a plan was forming. Not out of greed, more out of curiosity. I wanted to see how far I could go without technically breaking the law. But the more I thought about it, the more that line began to fade. On March 14, I made the first copy of the shadow system onto a separate drive. A small data stick hidden inside the casing of an old hard disk. No one noticed. It looked like routine maintenance. I tested how the system reacted to duplication. No alerts, no trace. Too easy, too clean. From that moment on, every night turned into a laboratory. I ran the shadow system at home, on an old server, studying every command, every response. Lines of code scrolled across the screen like breathing, steady, mechanical, soulless. But the more I explored, the stronger the feeling grew that I was not alone. Sometimes the cursor froze by itself, as if someone on the other end was watching. I would shut everything down and sit there in the dark, listening to my heartbeat, hammering in the silence. March 17. I discovered that my security pass had been used twice during the night, when I was not in the building. That meant someone knew. Someone had found out that I had uncovered the shadow. That was the moment I realized there was no turning back. March 21, 2014, Friday. The morning Zurich air was sharp and clean, the kind that bites your lungs when you breathe too deeply. I arrived at the headquarters of Alpenkredit Bank at precisely 8:42. The glass facade reflected the pale sky, and from the outside it looked more like an art gallery than a financial institution. There were no signs, no slogans, no advertisements. Just a silver plaque near the door with 5 engraved letters, AKBZH. Those who needed to know what it meant already did. I had been sent there as part of a joint audit between Breaktech Security and the bank internal IT department. The official goal was to test their encrypted data channels and verify compliance with European banking standards. Unofficially, I wanted to understand how a place like this operated, a bank that trusted no one but itself. Inside, the silence was almost oppressive. The floor gleamed like liquid steel. The temperature never changed, always exactly 21 degrees Celsius. I remember noticing the faint scent of antiseptic in the air, the kind hospitals use to disguise sterility. Every movement echoed, every camera followed. At 9 o'clock sharp, I was issued a temporary access badge with my name, Artyom Koldin, and a 6-digit code. The security officer, Marcus Stein, handed it to me without a word. His eyes were cold and unreadable. Alpenkredit was not an ordinary bank. It served fewer than 200 clients worldwide. Industrial magnates, old families, and politicians who preferred their names not to appear anywhere. No advertisements, no press releases. Every transaction handled manually. Every request verified by 2 living people and 1 machine. The entire system was built on trust, but a strange, circular kind of trust. The bank trusted only itself. That morning, I began my inspection from the lower server wing, a restricted floor beneath Paradeplatz, 5 meters below ground level. Access required 2 keycards and simultaneous biometric verification. It took nearly 3 minutes for the reinforced door to unlock. Behind it, a narrow corridor led to a white room filled with noise. Racks of machines lined the walls, each labeled in small Helvetica type. The hum was steady, almost hypnotic. I checked the logs as instructed. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. No interruptions, no failed authentications, no irregular traffic. In cybersecurity, perfection is suspicious. I ran a trace on the internal network, and that was when I saw it. A mirrored partition inside their core database. Timestamped March 7, 2014. 2 weeks earlier. It was not in the documentation. A hidden mirror, isolated but synchronized every 48 hours. I froze for a moment. The same pattern I had seen in Nordinvest Bank. An invisible twin. A digital reflection that did not officially exist. I copied the hash ID into my notebook. Mirror node AKBZH shadow 03. Then the line flickered and disappeared, as if someone had just noticed my presence. I leaned back in the chair, my palms damp. The air seemed heavier now, the hum of the servers slower. I tried to breathe evenly, but the thought would not leave me. Someone had built the same system here in Switzerland, using the same architecture, the same timing, the same silence. 11:26. I left the server room, signing out on the digital pad. The guard barely looked up. Outside, the marble lobby seemed brighter than before, painfully white. People walked past carrying folders and tablets, their expressions fixed and lifeless. It was a building where everyone was watched, and no one looked at anyone directly. That night, back in my rented apartment near Langstrasse, I spread my notes on the desk. Two banks, two mirror systems, identical timestamps, identical structure. Someone was creating a network of shadows, replicas of real financial systems connected through invisible lines. Independent from any government, any audit, any trace. I sat there until 3:10 in the morning, watching the city lights fade one by one. Somewhere between the glowing numbers on my screen, I felt the weight of inevitability. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about connection, about being pulled into something that already existed long before I arrived. Alpencredit trusted itself completely, and that trust was the perfect disguise. June 12, 2014, Thursday, Zurich. The morning air was heavy, and low clouds pressed against the lake like a lid, trapping the city inside a gray shell. I remember that day because it was the first time I saw the name R. Vogel in the operational journal. The log file was part of a daily integrity check running on Alpencredit's internal transaction simulator. The purpose was simple: to stress test the payment gateway before live operations began. At 7:45 each morning, but what caught my eye was the pattern. The same account, R. Vogel, authorizing test transactions at precisely 0600 every day, weekends included. The entry carried a system tag level 3, reserved for employees with executive clearance. Except there was no such employee. The database of registered personnel contained no Vogel at all. The last surname starting with V was Vogt from compliance, and he had retired in 2009. I cross-checked again, searching for temporary accounts, contractor IDs, anything that might explain it. Nothing. At 8:20, I sent a brief report to the system's oversight mailbox as protocol demanded. 2 hours later, a reply came from internal administration. A single line stating, "Do not alter or question these entries. They belong to the internal audit program. This correspondence is confidential." I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide whether it was genuine or generated automatically. Alpencredit had strict procedures, but the tone felt different, more like a warning than an instruction. I archived the email and went back to the logs, but the numbers would not leave me alone. Over the next week, I watched the pattern continue. The same time, the same account, the same amount. Always. Exactly 250,000 Swiss francs processed as a test transaction, and reversed 3 minutes later. No irregularities, no failures, no alerts. Just a perfect loop of invisible money moving nowhere. Each execution generated a checksum identical to the previous one, something that statistically should have been impossible. By June 26th, I was certain it was no audit at all. It was too precise, too rhythmic, like a pulse. That evening, I stayed in the office long after the others left. The building was quiet, the air systems humming softly. I connected to the internal backup registry, a tool rarely used since the infrastructure overhaul in 2010. According to the Asset Archive, there had once been a redundant data node located off-site in Cloten, labeled AKB ARC 04, decommissioned, destroyed, February 3, 2009. All storage media recorded as shredded and recycled. Yet when I traced the authorization route for R. Vogel, it led directly there. The path was active and encrypted under a certificate still valid. The encryption key time-stamped only 6 days earlier. I remember leaning back in my chair and feeling the room shrink around me. The realization spreading slowly across my mind like ink in water. Someone had linked a dead server back into the living network, a ghost system masquerading as an audit node. If that connection existed, then everything passing through Alpencredit was being mirrored, stored somewhere beyond control. On July 1st, I ran a passive ping to test if the old node responded. The response came instantly, with a latency of 7 milliseconds. Too fast for an external line. It had to be inside the bank infrastructure, but invisible to standard monitoring. I logged the event manually, printed the trace on paper, and locked it in my drawer. That night, I could not sleep, my thoughts circling around a single question. Why would anyone resurrect a destroyed backup server? Unless they wanted history to live again. By mid-July, I began to notice subtle changes around the office. Marcus Stein, the security officer, now checked visitor badges twice instead of once. The camera in corridor C2, that had been inactive for years, suddenly rotated again. Small things, details that most people would ignore. But for someone who spent his life watching patterns, they stood out sharply. The bank was becoming aware of something, though I could not tell whether it was me or the ghost I had found. July 23, 2014. I entered the data chamber at 7:15 under the pretext of verifying log compression ratios. The hum of the machines was steady, constant, the light, white and cold. I opened the primary console and accessed the audit cache. The R. Vogel entries had vanished, replaced by blank lines labeled System Reconciliation. No timestamp, no metadata. Someone had wiped the trail clean, but not perfectly. The deletion left behind a gap in the sequence, a missing minute between 0600 and 0601. 30 seconds of silence in a system that never slept. 30 seconds that did not exist anywhere else in the record. That was the first time I felt fear. Not professional curiosity, but the slow, physical kind that begins in the stomach and spreads outward. I realized that whatever operated under the name R. Vogel was not a mistake. It was deliberate, and whoever had removed the evidence knew exactly how deep I had looked. I printed nothing. I saved nothing. I simply logged off and walked out into the Zurich rain. The sound of the drops on the pavement merging with the pulse in my head. 3 months before the incident, I had stumbled into the shadow of something larger than I could define. A system that used perfection as camouflage. A mirror that reflected not images but transactions. A ghost living inside the trust of a bank that believed it could never betray itself. And I had just seen its trace blink for the last time before disappearing into the dark. March 15th, 2017. A Wednesday morning that began like any other. I arrived at the office at 7:20, and the sky over Zurich was pale and thin as tissue paper. I remember the exact sequence, because that day I opened a file that would not leave me for months afterwards. My name is Lucas Steiner, and for 12 years I had been a systems analyst responsible for backup integrity and archival processes inside AlpenCredit's Operations Center. The task that morning was routine, a scheduled verification of off-site archives and a cross-check of our retention indexes. But routine is a dangerous word in a place that measures risk by the second. At 0743, I accessed the catalog labeled AKB Archive Master and scrolled down to the list of preserved nodes and media. The list was tidy, entries with serial numbers, dates, and destruction certificates. One item stood out, an entry dated February 3, 2009. The row read, AKB Arco 4, decommissioned, media shredded certificate, DRN 2009-0203. Signed, Hans Reiter, former IT director. The line ended there, and in my head, a thin alarm bell began to tinkle, because that serial number kept resurfacing in unrelated traces I had been following for weeks. The index said destroyed, but when I opened the verification bundle, I found a pointer not to a tape, but to a mounted image. A live mount with a timestamp that began in 2001 and ran in continuous segments through to the present day. At 0758, I realized I was looking at a full operational archive that contained transaction shadows starting from September 9th, 2001. The sheer scale made my mouth dry. Hundreds of thousands of entries, each file labeled with the original transaction ID, the originating branch, the timestamp, and a curious, consistent alteration in the beneficiary field. The recipient for each shadowed transaction was not the real destination, but an account labeled Internal Risk Account-47. I sat back and tried to articulate the absurdity in technical terms. Each shadow was a verbatim copy of a legitimate MT-103 or similar payment instruction. Every detail mirrored, down to the SWIFT reference. And yet the payee line had been replaced systematically with the same internal account code. The amounts were identical, the currency tags untouched. The sequence numbers matched the live ledgers, and there was no record in the primary journals that money had ever left the bank. Therefore, on paper, no movement had occurred. And yet somewhere in the shadows, a hidden ledger accumulated a balance that did not appear on any regulatory report. At 0816, I traced the provenance of the archive image. The header contained a maintenance signature and an old certification hash, which indicated the image had been created during a migration cycle in 2006. But the file modifications showed edits made as recently as March 11, 2017. The checksum history suggested the container had been resurrected from a set of media that procurement had certified destroyed and recycled 8 years earlier. The image carried markers that implied deliberate concealment. Tags like Archive Shadow and Project Echo embedded in metadata fields that in normal times were never touched. I documented everything in the incident notebook that I keep for anomalies. I recorded timestamps, volume counts, and the exact path names, AK Archive 01/TX Shocks/2001-current. I made copies to a secure USB, and then I did what every analyst does when reality starts to bend. I stepped away and tried to translate the evidence into motive. I considered benign scenarios, a compliance test gone wrong, an overzealous internal audit, a research sandbox left connected by mistake. None of those explanations fit, because the shadows were too precise and the edits too consistent. There was intention in the work, and that intention followed a financial logic. At 0905, I escalated the findings to our internal security channel, and I sent an encrypted notice to Marcus Becker, the Chief Information Security Officer. His response was delayed and clinical. He advised containment and quiet forensic imaging. But the delay in his reply felt like distance. A day later, Anna Keller from Forensics arrived. She ran a checksum comparison and confirmed the shadows reconciled to live transactions, with a fault tolerance so low it was practically exact. She found fragmentation patterns consistent with deliberate striping to avoid detection. And she found something else, a routing header that pointed outward, not to a bank partner, but to a series of proxy nodes in Northern Europe. The practical implication of what we were seeing was terrifying. In theory, if money could be diverted into an internal risk account that existed only in the shadow archive, then the system would accept the movement as legitimate, because the primary reconciliation routines compared the live journals against the shadow set. And if those matched, then all controls would report green. In effect, the bank could transfer cash into a ghost account and then authorize its release from the ghost without generating alerts. The mechanism was elegant and cold. It used the bank's own trust and its own archival chain to cloak movement. The more I dug, the stranger the personal consequences became. On March 20th, my access logs showed a probe from a node labeled LND Gateway, and my proximity badge had 2 unauthorized swipe attempts recorded at midnight, though I was home in my flat. The security team later said it was a false positive, but I knew otherwise. Someone was noticing the curiosity of the person who read metadata for pleasure. And for a day or two, I felt the sensation of being watched, a tightness behind my eyes that made concentration shallow. Over the next week, we rebuilt the archived images in isolated, air-gapped environments. We ran simulated reconciliations, and we watched as the shadow ledger quietly accepted transactions and then cleared them from the visible registers. The process left no conventional trace of theft and no immediate red flag for auditors. The money in the shadow pool could be moved out by feeding another series of internal transfers that mimicked legitimate operations, and then removed by a mirrored withdrawal orchestrated through third-party clearinghouses. The sophistication suggested knowledge of both banking procedures and the human complacency that comes from long-term internal trust. On March 25th, I found a log fragment buried deep in the container. It carried a note in plain text. Last maintenance performed by H. Reiter. Confirmation signature, archived by Project Echo. The simplicity of that line chilled me. Hans Reiter had retired in 2009. He had access to the systems in the 2000 to 2006 window. He had overseen media decommissioning. The paper trail bore his name. And yet, here in the binary, the work marched on as if someone had kept his keys. I ended that month with a sense of smallness and a sense of inevitability. I had discovered an archive that should not have existed, a mirror that could be fed to make an entire ledger lie. I had seen the mechanism where an entire institution could be used to launder its own money under the cover of its archival confidence. And I had the fingerprints of past custodians in the metadata, which proved nothing and everything at once. In the quiet hours, I began to understand why the vaults and the ledgers seemed so secure. Because security was not only about locks and alarms, it was about stories people told themselves to sleep at night. And I had just found a story that was designed to disappear into the dark. January 9th, 2018, 1:47 in the morning, Zurich time. The data center was running in night maintenance mode. Low traffic, minimal staff. Only 2 operators on call, and myself monitoring the transaction queue from home through a secured VPN connection. It was supposed to be a quiet shift, just routine liquidity balancing before the market opened in London. But then the alert counter flickered once and stopped. I watched as a single transaction line appeared in the event buffer. Value 12.4 million euros. Origin account Alp Reserve Fund. Destination Ternal Risk Account -47. Status cleared. Processing time 6 seconds. Audit flag none. Verification bypassed. At 1:48, the record was archived automatically and tagged as Automatic Currency Reserve Correction. The phrase meant nothing special in itself. The system used it for internal balance adjustments, but the amount was too large and too round, 12.4 million, not broken down into any typical tranche size. I refreshed the monitoring console 3 times. The transaction remained perfectly valid. Checksum complete. Signature verified. Authorization tag belonging to the central liquidity manager. Yet the timestamp on that key was 42 minutes after he had logged out of the system. By 2:05, I ran a reconciliation report comparing live balances against the shadow archive and noticed the discrepancy. The main journal showed the reserve fund diminished by exactly 12.4 million euros, but the shadow ledger mirrored the transfer as if it had never occurred. Technically, the 2 records were both true. The perfect paradox of digital accounting. One line of code saying yes, another saying no, and both validated by the same encryption key. I printed the summary and stored it in a sealed envelope marked Anomaly 901. At 8:10 in the morning, the executive committee gathered for the daily liquidity briefing. The head of Treasury, Marcus Stein, reviewed the balance sheet and saw the missing $12.4 million. He treated it as a mechanical fault, a buffer misalignment after the nightly maintenance. His conclusion was swift. He authorized a manual correction from the internal risk reserve. The money was re-entered into the reserve fund before 9:30, and the systems returned to equilibrium. The incident report was labeled as Technical Irregularity, Closed, with no external notification. I watched the process unfold from the observation console, my chest tight, as if waiting for an aftershock that never came. The following days were outwardly calm, but the figures began to drift in the background. Every time the system performed its automatic midnight balance cycle, small rounding errors appeared and vanished, leaving faint traces that no one except me seemed to notice the ghost of. 12.4 million lingered in the pattern like a heartbeat under the surface. On January 16th, exactly 7 days after the first disappearance, the internal risk reserve showed a deficit again. Not 12.4 this time, but precisely the same amount, reconstructed and removed from the same invisible channel. The account that officially did not exist had drained itself to zero without a single recorded transaction. At 9:45 that morning, I checked the audit logs. The entry that should have recorded the previous week's correction was blank, replaced with a null value. No timestamp, no operator code, just an empty cell between two valid records. It was like finding a missing tooth in a mouth of perfect enamel. I attempted a deeper probe through the backup chain, but every mirrored node returned identical emptiness. The absence was not a glitch. It was a deletion, performed by someone who understood the system's own redundancy mechanisms and knew how to make absence look like place. Compliance? I began tracing cross-references across subnetworks, looking for any sign of data replication that could explain where the money had gone. The investigation led me into the maintenance history of the archive that I had discovered months before. The Ghost Repository, AKB ARC-04. Inside it, the transaction existed as a shadow, but with an altered narrative. The payment reference field carried the same 12.4 million euros, but the beneficiary tag was different. It pointed to an external clearinghouse code registered in Tallinn, Estonia, a code that Alpenkredit had never used since its founding in 1974. The deeper I looked, the more impossible the pattern became. The shadow system had its own sense of history. It edited time in small increments, realigning records so that the impossible became statistically plausible. At 11:37, I compared the checksum tree of the current archive with the one I had preserved months earlier. They no longer matched. Several thousand lines had shifted order, some deleted, others rewritten. Yet the root signature still validated the entire block. It was as if the archive had healed itself, closing wounds without leaving scars. By the next morning, internal communications were subdued. Security updates came unsigned. The forensics team circulated no memos. I started to feel that the building itself was watching us. Cameras subtly re-angled, card readers lagging a second before opening. Doors in the cafeteria, people spoke softer, as if the air could transmit suspicion. I remember sitting by the window at 12:15, the light reflecting on the glass in such a way that my own reflection looked like a stranger's face staring back. The question pulsed endlessly. Who had the authority to rewrite time? On January 23rd, the audit office released a formal note titled Routine Recalibration of the Internal Liquidity Model. And within that sterile phrase, the disappearance was buried. It said that historical reserves had been adjusted to account for fluctuations in cross-market exposure and that all associated discrepancies were resolved. I read the note twice. The tone of it too clean, too final. My anomaly report 901 was quietly removed from the archive queue without a trace, and my user account was reassigned to the low-access monitoring group. I could still see the numbers, but no longer touch them. That night, I stayed in my apartment on the east side of Zurich, unable to sleep. The air outside heavy with snow. I opened my private backup, a copy of the original Shadow archive I had taken months earlier, and scrolled again through the rows of data. At 1:47, January 9th. The ghost entry still shown, intact. The first disappearance, frozen in digital amber as proof that once it had existed. I realized that the system had learned to erase its own witnesses, and the only thing it had not yet erased was me. From that moment, I stopped believing that Alpencredit was merely a bank. It was something else. A machine built to feed upon its own balance sheets, an organism that consumed trust and returned perfection as camouflage. I had watched 12.4 million euros vanish into that perfection. And the terrifying part was not that it was gone, but that the world outside would never know that it had been there at all. April 4th, 2018, Wednesday morning. The letter arrived by courier at 0912. The envelope was plain, heavy cream stock, without a return address. The courier's signature on the manifest read only as a set of initials that meant nothing to our reception team. I was summoned to the executive floor at 10:03 by a terse internal memo that asked me to review a physical delivery marked for the Chief Information Security Officer, Marcus Becker. I remember the corridor to the executive suite being unnaturally bright, as if the building itself had decided to spotlight the event before the envelope was opened. When the envelope was placed on the polished oak table, I examined it. With the sterile curiosity of someone who had spent years cataloging anomalies its edges bore, faint abrasions, consistent with an older mechanical typewriter. And the flap was sealed with a subtle strip of adhesive that showed no tamper marks, the absence of fingerprints. And the lack of an inked stamp suggested the sender had gone to several lengths to remain physically untraceable. The letter itself was printed on a typewritten sheet in an old-style, monospaced font. The text was short and measured. It stated in plain language that the authors were not thieves and that they were only returning balance. The signature line carried a name that by then was already whispered in internal notes. Project Echo. There were no threats, no demands, no deadlines. Nothing that resembled the classic pattern of extortion. The note did not ask for money or favors. It made a different claim. It enclosed an appendix, a file printed on multiple pages, a ledger-like document that at first glance resembled an internal audit. The header read, Operational Summary, and beneath it was a tabulation of transactions spanning a decade from 2008 through 2017. Each row bore an original transaction ID, the originating branch, the original beneficiary, and then beside each entry a second column labeled Shadow Beneficiary, which in almost every case read Internal Risk Account -47. I laid the pages in sequence and watched the faint ink form an image. I saw dates, stamps, and amounts that matched or mirrored our live ledgers, yet in the shadow column, the recipient had been replaced by the same code, over and over. The pattern was not random, it was authored. It traced a systematic rerouting of funds that, in aggregate, summed to amounts large enough to alter regional balance sheets. The table included names of corporate entities, many of them shell formations registered in jurisdictions we did not normally transact with. Yet the accompanying notes indicated that those entities served discretionary vehicles for political funds and long-standing family trusts. I recorded the exact time and the names in my incident notebook. Then I photographed the pages forensically and transferred the images to an isolated forensic workstation. Anna Keller performed an initial hash comparison within an hour. She confirmed that the printed spreads corresponded to export files in CSV format, and that those files carried internal metadata fields not normally available to external reports. The metadata contained author stamps with initials HR and a maintenance tag dated 2006, which linked back to Hans Reiter, who had been the IT director at the time of media decommissioning. His name had surfaced before in buried logs, but here it appeared as if his authorization lingered in the very bones of the data. At 1327, the chief of legal requested custody of the original pages. The legal team took possession and placed them in a sealed evidence envelope, while the security team began a parallel review to identify the courier path. CCTV footage was pulled for the entry points on April 4th, and the previous day, the footage showed only routine comings and goings, no one carrying a heavy parcel that matched the envelope, and no vehicle loitering in front of the building matched the manifest. The courier company insisted their route was standard and that the signature was taken at our reception desk, which created more questions because our reception logs showed no one signing under the courier initials at 0912. That evening, I extracted the CSV embedded in the appendix. The file, named operative_log_2008_2017.csv, was encoded in a way that suggested deliberate obfuscation, column headers padded with null bytes, timestamps rounded to the nearest minute, and a checksum tree that matched a structure I had seen before in the Shadow Archive. The file, when loaded into the forensic environment, revealed a layer of transactions that paralleled our official ledger, but diverged in the DI beneficiary column, and in a subset of entries contained an additional tag labeled Political Fund Code, PF-, and a numerical series that traced back to shell entities incorporated in Malta, Cyprus, and the Isle of Man. Over the next 3 days, the bank responded with official calm. The executive committee issued a memo describing the letter as an anonymous disclosure and stated that all information would be handled internally. The press remained unaware, and regulators were not informed. A decision made at that level would later prove consequential. I watched the committee move with surgical deliberation, as if they were trying to contain a virus while also limiting the oxygen it needed to spread. Meanwhile, I continued my private review, and the more I dug, the more the pattern sharpened. On April 7th, I located a cross-reference. The political fund codes in the operative log matched account references found in an archival subset labeled Client Confidential 3, a tranche of files I had previously flagged as suspicious. When investigating obsolete media, the matching was precise. Social welfare transfers, philanthropic grants, and pension top-ups, all recorded as legitimate activity on the live ledger. Yet, on the shadow copy, those same flows corresponded to transfers routed through internal risk account 47, and then into numbered conduits that ended at correspondent banks in Tallinn and Riga. The implications began to settle like cold lead in my stomach. It was not simply embezzlement or money laundering in the conventional sense. It was a structural operation that used the bank's own archival mechanism as a clearing system. It exploited institutional trust. The fact that internal reconciliation compared live books against an authoritative archive meant that if the archive itself was doctored, the whole accounting apparatus would validate a lie and present it as truth, to auditors, to regulators, and to clients. I documented every cross-match and every metadata signature. I traced the chain of custody of supposedly destroyed media and found gaps where procurement records ended and binary traces continued in hidden containers. The letter had given us a dossier, and the dossier named a long list of victims and beneficiaries. Half of the corporate names on the list did not conduct real business. They existed to receive and disperse funds on behalf of political operations and family trusts. And the ledger suggested this had been a normalized practice for years. On April 10th, my access to certain archival indexes was restricted, without explanation. My badge permissions were changed, and I received an automated notification that my role was under review. I printed one final copy of the operative log and sealed it in my private archive. I took the file home, and for the first time, I felt the weight of complicity, not as accusation, but as exposure. I had seen the anatomy of a system that could quietly return or reroute balance, and I had seen the names it touched. I realized then that Project Echo was less a group than a method that formalized the bank's own silence into currency, and that the letter arriving on April 4th was not a confession. It was a demonstration and a warning. In the nights that followed, the city felt different, the streets smaller, the windows of office towers like unblinking eyes. I began keeping the printed pages beneath my mattress, not to hide them, but to remind myself that what I held was proof that the bank we trusted had a shadow ledger, and that in that silence, entire sums of money could move and vanish, and nobody in the light would ever notice. May 17th, 2018. A cold Friday morning, the kind that makes the air in Zurich taste metallic, I arrived at the operations center before sunrise. The night shift had already reported that a mutual assistance request had come through from the Norwegian National Authority for Investigation of Economic Crime, Økokrim. They were coordinating with Swiss Federal Police over a server cluster found during a routine inspection of an abandoned data hall in Tromsø, northern Norway. The request cited digital evidence that might relate to Alpenkredit. The message was time-stamped 0542 and marked urgent. By 0615, the Internal Security Committee had convened. Marcus Becker from Information Security, Anna Keller from Forensics, and myself representing Systems Analytics. The brief was short. Økokrim had seized 26 servers from a facility registered under a shell company called Norwave Data Holdings. The servers were still live when investigators entered the premises. Each one configured with a mirrored RAID array and a redundant power cell. The system uptime read 1,864 days, meaning the machines had been operational continuously since April 24, 2013. The strange part was the data volume, over 400 terabytes of encrypted information distributed evenly across all nodes. The directory names were meaningless alphanumeric strings, but one stood out: ALP Arch 47. At 0740, I received a secure file transfer from the Norwegian investigators. The contents were partial index maps extracted from the drives. The pattern of folder hierarchies was unmistakable. It mirrored our own archival structure precisely. Even the naming convention followed internal Alpenkredit logic, TX log/year/batch number. The investigators had stumbled upon a remote clone of our internal archive, down to the checksum schema used in our 2010 retention cycle. But the encryption header carried a signature that should not have existed outside our network. The forensic opening of the first volume was performed in Oslo at 0918 Central European Time, using hardware isolation protocols supervised by a joint team of Norwegian and Swiss specialists. The moment the decryption key resolved, the system registered a root certificate that matched Alpenkredit's internal authorization chain, serial number 2006-1117-004 H. Reiter, the same signature belonging to the former IT director whose digital credentials had supposedly expired 9 years earlier. The implication struck everyone simultaneously. Whoever had built the archive in Tromsø had not hacked into Alpenkredit. They had built the protective layer themselves, from within. At 10:02, a secondary analysis revealed that one of the mirrored volumes contained compressed log exports labeled Echo Build Reference 372 timestamped February 9, 2017. These were incremental deltas of transaction shadow files, identical to those we had discovered in Zurich, but with additional control fields. The metadata contained an internal key variable named MK4 control hash, the same control variable used in the bank's internal code base. This meant that the encryption routines had been compiled with access to the proprietary source libraries, something that only an authorized developer or audit consultant could possess. By noon, the Zurich office was in lockdown. No one outside the investigation cell was permitted to communicate externally. All outgoing mail servers were rerouted through the compliance relay. At 12:47, I received a list of former IT contractors who had worked under Alpen Kredit's Audit and Compliance Division between 2009 and 2012. One name immediately froze me in place. Erik Madsen, Norwegian citizen, born 1982. Listed as a senior audit systems consultant, contracted through a firm called Arcturus Advisory. He had worked on the bank's infrastructure penetration resilience program for 2 years. His contract ended abruptly in June 2012, and his exit interview was missing from the records. At 14:23, Norwegian police located Madsen's name on a property lease in Tromsø, registered under Norwave Holdings. His last tax record, dated 2016, described him as a data security consultant specializing in network redundancy. The investigators entered the property that afternoon and found what they later described as a private data bunker. Cold concrete walls, fiber conduits leading underground, rows of servers running in isolation. No external internet lines, only encrypted satellite uplinks. The timestamp logs matched the replication cycles from Alpen Kredit down to the millisecond. Every night at 01:47 Geneva time, the servers synchronized with an unknown source node. The forensic team extracted one file, marked MK4 Syslog Archive 2017. The checksum validation confirmed it was genuine. Alpen Kredit's system output, during the partial decoding, they discovered a residual key string embedded in the binary header, a phrase that should never appear outside development environments. Internal risk balance verification. The string served as the initialization vector for a shadow routine that authorized internal fund transfers without audit triggers. It was not a hack, it was architecture designed from inside the institution. The realization settled through the room in silence. The criminals had not broken through the walls, they had drawn the blueprints and built the walls themselves. At 17:35 Zurich time, the Joint Task Force convened via secure conference line. The Swiss prosecutor's office demanded complete access to Alpen Kredit's archival and development records. Becker resisted, citing confidentiality obligations. But by 1800, the federal warrant arrived. The investigation officially changed status from internal review to criminal inquiry. By nightfall, the story reached only the highest echelons of internal governance. No leaks, no press. The bank's public image untouched. But inside the halls, the tension was tangible. Every sound of a printer, every flicker of a monitor felt amplified. Over the next week, the forensics continued. They traced encrypted backups from Tromsø to secondary replication nodes located in Narvik and Bodo, each containing fragments of the same shadow archive. When the Norwegian experts correlated metadata timestamps, they realized the replication schedule originated directly from a Zurich subnet that had been listed as dormant since 2011. Subnet 10.1456.7. Internal Range Classification Level 3, reserved for audit testing. The subnet had never been disconnected. The data center staff had simply lost documentation over time. On May 24th, Økokrim released a classified interim statement. The servers in Norway had stored complete transactional copies from Alpen Kredit's internal systems between 2008 and 2017. The encryption keys were authentic and originated from code libraries owned by the bank. The developers of those libraries included former consultants, now untraceable. The primary suspect, Eric Madsen, was still missing. His apartment empty, his personal bank accounts untouched, his phone disconnected for 9 months. The final technical report arrived in Zurich on May 27th at 21:12. It confirmed what we had already suspected. The encrypted archive contained active root keys, valid against Alpenkredit's live infrastructure. The integrity check revealed those keys were still authorized, meaning the bank's access control framework continued to accept credentials issued by ghosts from the past. I remember closing the report and feeling a hollow calm, realizing that the greatest breach in the bank's history had not come from outside, but had been engineered patiently by someone who understood trust better than anyone. In the weeks that followed, every server log, every transaction trace, every checksum seemed to whisper the same truth. The people behind Project Echo had never needed to steal anything. They had written themselves into the system's DNA, their fingerprints indistinguishable from its own. I understood then that the data center in Tromsø was not a hideout. It was a mirror, and that somewhere between Zurich and the Arctic Circle, the reflection of Alpenkredit continued to run quietly, waiting for its next synchronization cycle. June 6, 2018, Wednesday, early morning. Zurich light was thin and hesitant when I walked into the operations center at 07:12. I remember the date because it was exactly 10 days after the Norwegian report arrived, and because nothing about that day felt routine anymore. The week since Tromsø had been a blur of sealed rooms, encrypted handoffs, and meetings under legal advisories. The bank had moved from curiosity to containment, and containment had a language of its own. At 08:00, the executive committee convened in the boardroom on the 10th floor. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and expensive coffee. Christoph Lang, the CEO, presided with the measured calm of someone who lived by procedure. Marcus Becker, our CISO, sat to his right, papers in neat stacks. Marcus Stein, head of Treasury, attended, with a laptop open to real-time liquidity feeds. The agenda in the notice had one line: freeze assets and invoke insurance protocol INS Pro 2018. That morning, I was there as a technical witness. I had been asked to prepare a short briefing on the nature of the shadow ledger and the risks it posed to depositor confidence. The documented reason for the protocol was simple. The bank had to set aside a reserve large enough to cover any claim that might emerge if regulators or major clients learned of irregular archival practices. The thinking was conservative and cold. It was also defensive. If a transfer could be masked under internal reconciliation, then placing those sums into a formally frozen account would at least create a public record and demonstrate prudence. What the committee did not realize was that our public gesture would mirror the very maneuver Project Echo had used for years. At 09:14, Marcus Stein authorized an internal transfer from the bank's main liquidity hub. The transaction was logged as INS Pro 2018, Step 1, amount 468 million euros, destination Internal Risk Account -47, reference freeze assets pending regulatory audit. The Treasury system stamped the entry. It queued through the same internal transport layer that had processed the earlier anomalies. The copy went into the live journal and, as protocol demanded, into the archival feed for reconciliation. The action felt administratively correct, precise, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to believe in procedure. By 09:46, reconciliation reports began to return green. The system said balance matched, archive matched, reconciliation matched. and the executive team nodded. The motion was perfunctory. They achieved what they wanted. A frozen reserve recorded on the books, a notification to auditors, and a short statement prepared for regulators in case the press ever asked. The ledger now bore a line that said the bank had prudently set aside nearly €500 million. The public story would be one of caution and control. It was not until the second week that the truth revealed itself in the most undramatic of ways. A routine compliance sweep on June 13th at 11:03 by Anna Keller in forensics showed a discrepancy. The frozen reserve did not exist in the shadow archive. Where we expected to find the corresponding mirror entry, the INS Pro 2018 line on our live journal had never been reflected back into the externalized archive records. The trail diverged precisely at the moment the transfer acknowledged completion in our systems. Instead of an internal mirroring, the archive showed an outbound routing header pointing to an external correspondent node. I remember the exact phrasing of the log fragment because I saw it and then reread it until the letters blurred out. The fragment read, "Route out, Ka, respondent, BIC, XXXXXXXX. To Clearinghouse, code EE, Tallinn, 3091. The clearing path did not match any authorized partner in our master agreements, and yet the routing carried valid signatures and a chain of custody that passed HSM verification. The system accepted the change as though it were a routine correspondence settlement and closed the item as reconciled. By June 14th, the legal team had escalated to FINMA. Our regulators wanted immediate access. But the problem was not a missing SWIFT or a forged message. It was architecture. The movement had been performed through the bank's own trusted reconciliation mechanisms, so there were no error flags, no external intrusion signatures, no forensic residue that pointed to a breach. Someone had used the bank's trust as a veil, and the trace led outward, as if the bank itself had authorized an external settlement. The money had gone without breaking a window or raising an alarm. We called correspondent banks, we opened tickets with major clearinghouses, and we interrogated SWIFT logs from the period. The replies were mundane and consistent. They showed receipt of settlement instructions forwarded by Alpenkredit and subsequent onward confirmations. The node in Tallinn returned a confirmation message that funds were in transit through a chain of small intermediaries. The chain telescoped until the final leg recorded only an account held under a numbered conduit at an offshore clearing entity. The account numbers were valid. The names attached to them were shell corporations, and the jurisdictions were ones we had seen before in the Project Echo dossier. Over the next 48 hours, forensics ran every possible comparison. We rebuilt transaction trees, we replayed message sequences, and we compared HSM logs side by side with the archival snapshots. But every piece slipped into place. The signatures validated, the keys, the checksums reconciled, and the pattern read like a confession written by the bank itself. There was no evidence of outside code injection, no foreign root certificate, no brute force intrusion. It was not a theft in the conventional sense. It was a reattribution performed by the trust framework. The institution's own logic had been hijacked to authorize an outbound flow that looked like internal housekeeping. On June 15th at 02:21, the Treasury system produced a final reconciliation that closed INS Pro 2018. The entry declared the assets frozen and accounted for in an internal risk pool. The public face was neat. The internal reality was empty. It occurred to me then, with a cold clarity, that the very act we had taken to protect the bank had been used to complete the invisible operation. The bank had moved money into an account that was never meant to surface in audits, and in doing so, it replicated the doorway that allowed the original shadow transfers to escape. I sat alone in the darkened server room that night, and watched the monitoring consoles reflect the same green status messages that had lulled the committee into comfort. The hum of the racks was the same as always, and yet there was a new sound beneath it, a soft, mechanical certainty. The system would perform as designed because someone had taught it new purposes, months or years earlier. The danger was not malicious code. It was domestication of trust. The bank trusted itself so completely that it could no longer distinguish between its own books and a ledger designed to lie. When the public statement was finally drafted, it spoke of prudence and due process. It called the action a preventative measure in line with best practice, the board-approved phrasing that would satisfy regulators and reassure clients. The press released a short paragraph and moved on. The headline read, "Alpencredit freezes assets pending audit." And then, the world returned to its usual appetite for simpler dramas. I remained awake for days after. In my notebook, I wrote down times and message IDs and the names of the correspondent nodes that had accepted the flow. I mapped the path until it became a dark lattice across the Baltic and the Atlantic. And I understood, in a way I had not before, that this was not about stealing currency. It was about turning truth into a garment that could be worn by anyone with the pattern of stitches. It had once seemed impossible to take money without a trace. Now, I had watched €500 million disappear, and the only trace left was the bank's own signature across each message. The invisible operation had been completed not by force, but by perfect compliance, and that realization was worse than any breach I had imagined. July 19, 2018, Thursday morning. Zurich was quiet in a way that felt staged. The streets seemed emptied by design. Even the trams passed slower than usual. I arrived at headquarters at 0742 with a sense that everything had already happened. The news reached us before the security filters could block it. Project Echo had spoken again, this time not through intrusion or data trace, but through a message left where the invisible congregate in the lowest corridors of the network. A letter appeared simultaneously on 3 Onion forums at 0413 UTC. The text was 12 lines long and signed, Echo, nothing more. The opening sentence froze me. It said, "We did not take a single euro. We only erased what should not have existed." It read like a confession and an absolution intertwined. Within hours, cybersecurity units from Bern and Geneva confirmed the source as a darknet relay, mirrored across anonymous nodes. Yet every instance traced back through an identical signature sequence registered to a ghosted IPv6 allocation tied to the University of Bern subnet. The simplicity of the trail was deliberate, too clean, too symmetric, like a signature written backwards on glass. At 0910, I was summoned to the incident room. The air was heavy with the sound of cooling fans, and fatigue screens along the wall displayed lines of the same message, repeated in different timestamps, each identical to the byte. The investigators from Fedpol and Interpol stood behind their terminals, whispering not conclusions, but disbelief. One of the analysts showed a log slice from the network perimeter, an outbound call at 041258 from a sandbox terminal that should have been isolated from external routing. The packet size was 52 kilobytes. The checksum matched the size of the letter file, which meant the message had been launched from within an environment connected to us. At 10:27, I reviewed the forensic notes and realized something that felt like vertigo. The internal metadata of the letter carried a timestamp offset that matched our archival mirror clocks to the second. It was as if the message had been written inside the same logical framework that handled our backups. Project Echo had not breached the system. They had used it as their pen to write their final phrase. The University of Bern team received the official request for access that afternoon. By 1545, their response arrived. The identified IP had last logged activity at 0417 before disappearing from the subnet entirely. A technician named Lucas Fry confirmed that the node corresponded to an unused workstation in the Computer Science Faculty Lab 3214. The system had been powered off since June, yet logs showed it came online for exactly 7 minutes before returning to standby. The access credentials were root local, the BIOS clock misaligned by 27 days, suggesting that the system had been virtualized and then restored the next day. An attempt was made to locate the physical terminal, but the serial tag on its motherboard did not correspond to any equipment registered since 2012. When they finally extracted the drive at 1833, the contents were absurdly minimal. A single text file, 19 bytes in size, named silence.txt. When opened, it contained a single phrase: "Silence is the best way to steal sound." Nothing else. No hidden partitions, no encrypted payload, no metadata linking it to any known user. The checksum matched no previous hashes in the threat libraries. The forensic team triple verified it. It was not malicious code, just a sentence. I stared at that phrase until my eyes blurred. It felt like a riddle designed to outlive evidence. The investigators wanted to parse it as metaphor, but I knew better. Silence was not a metaphor. In our systems, silence was the absence of trace, the deletion of sequence, the removal of cause and effect from the audit chain. If Project Echo had truly erased what should not have existed, then somewhere inside our own ledgers, the narrative of loss had been replaced by an intentional void, and the silence was not about morality, it was about control of memory. By July 20th at 0200, the press had already constructed its mythology. The story framed Project Echo as cyber anarchists, moral vigilantes, digital ghosts that punished corruption and left nothing but cryptic wisdom behind. The bank issued a neutral statement acknowledging the investigation, cooperation with authorities, and commitment to transparency. It was signed by Christoph Lang and distributed through Reuters. Before dawn the following morning, but inside the institution, we understood the deeper wound. Our archives had been amputated, not corrupted, not stolen, simply removed in a way that left integrity checks intact. We could prove that nothing was missing because the proofs themselves had been rewritten to exclude the missing pieces. That realization came quietly. On July 21st at 0628, when our compliance AI ran its scheduled index verification and returned 100% alignment, the system reported perfection, which was impossible because perfection meant erasure of imperfection itself, a paradox. The machines could not feel, but I could. The sense that history had been replaced by a mirror with no reflection. Every trace of the shadow accounts, every test transaction, every hint of Project Echo's infrastructure had vanished. Not overwritten, not hidden, but dissolved like ink in acid. In the following days, we cross-examined backups, external archives, national bank correspondence, yet everywhere the same pattern: clean, integrity confirmed across all ledgers, as if the story had never begun. The audit trail of 468 million euros ended, not in contradiction, but in compliance. The system did not scream, it whispered. Conformity. The forensic teams gave up on the notion of recovery. By July 25th, the case was reclassified from active breach to anomaly closure, and the term used in the final report was administrative normalization. I remember that phrase because it sounded like burial without ceremony. On July 29th at 23:57, I walked alone into the server vault for the last time. The temperature was kept constant at 18 degrees. The floor hummed with invisible order, and I thought about the first day I had joined Alpencredit 13 years earlier, believing in precision as a form of truth. The machines still blinked with quiet discipline, unaware that the story had consumed its own beginning and its own end. When I looked at the monitor nearest to the maintenance terminal, it showed 0 pending alerts, 0 discrepancies, 0 unresolved tickets. The perfect silence. I opened my personal notebook and wrote the last entry, the time, the date, and one sentence to remind myself that all of it had happened July 30th, 2018, 004. The end without a beginning. And I closed it, knowing that outside these walls, the world would remember a rumor about a hacker collective and a bank that lost nothing, but somehow was never the same again. The silence was complete, and in that silence, Project Echo still lived, not as data, not as code, but as absence itself. July 14th, 2019, Zurich. 1 year to the day since the event that had never officially occurred, I arrived at the headquarters of Alpen Credit at 0803. The marble floors gleamed with an artificial perfection, the kind that speaks more of staging than of maintenance. The security desk greeted me by name, the same way it always had. But something in the guard's tone suggested rehearsed distance. The building had the calm of a museum, where history was no longer being made, only preserved. At 0900, the annual shareholders meeting began. The agenda listed 6 items: routine updates on capital ratios, liquidity coverage, stress tests, and a short final report on the post-audit reconciliation. The last line in the printed packet was simple: financial recovery of operational variance, 100%, resolved. The words were bureaucratically perfect, mathematically absurd, and yet no one in the hall seemed inclined to question them. Christoph Lang stood at the podium, his posture unchanged from the year before. The lights reflected from the silver microphones, his voice steady as he began his address. The words were familiar: numbers, profit margins, percentage growth, distributions, and then the line that froze time itself. I still remember the rhythm of it, as if it were carved into my memory. The funds have been successfully restored to institutional reserves. Total exposure, 0. Residual loss, 0. The applause that followed was brief, respectful, restrained. At 0936, the first analyst report hit the wires. Alpen Credit confirms recovery of assets following internal review. The phrasing was deliberate, clinical, detached. The global markets responded with an upward flicker, and by the end of the day, the bank's shares had risen by 3.8%. There were congratulatory messages from partners in Geneva, London, and Singapore. There were interviews on CNBC and Bloomberg, where Lang repeated the same sentence: "Our internal processes have proven resilient, our integrity intact." Yet, beneath the veneer of success, there was only one truth. None of us could explain how the restoration had occurred. During the internal debrief at 11:12, the Compliance Division presented its final audit trail. Each transaction line reconciled, each mirror copy validated, the ledger matched the reserve. Every checksum aligned. The forensic team from Bern verified signatures and timestamps. Everything passed integrity tests. No inconsistencies, no unauthorized changes. The conclusion of the report was 5 words: funds appear to have rematerialized. The phrase itself, a confession disguised as observation. I was asked to review the underlying logs from the liquidity hub, the same subsystem that had once moved the €468 million block a year earlier. The data was immaculate. No gaps, no foreign entries, no ghosted sessions. The mirror backups that had vanished in 2018 now existed again, perfectly mirrored across the distributed archive. The creation, timestamps dated July 5, 2019, 02:41. The checksum history showed continuity, as if the data had never been absent. It was as if time itself had been rewritten to include the missing hours, the missing months, the missing truth. At 13:27, the press conference began. Lang stood before the cameras. Beside him, Marcus Becker and legal counsel Anya Ritter. The statement read aloud was direct. The temporary accounting discrepancy reported in 2018 has been fully reconciled. All institutional obligations have been met. Client funds unaffected. Internal systems verified and stabilized. Following extensive review, the bank wishes to thank its partners for their patience and confidence during the audit period. There were no questions that required answers. Every reporter in the room had already been briefed. Later that evening at 1844, I sat alone in my office, reviewing the raw replication data from the mirror servers in Zug. The replication pattern showed an unusual anomaly, a 13-minute offset in the recovery timestamps, precisely matching the duration of the network blackout that had occurred during the night of July 5th. The blackout had been recorded as scheduled maintenance, yet no one had authorized it. The system logs indicated a full restore from an unregistered archive node tagged with the identifier ECH0x2. The signature validation returned valid keys under the AlpenCredit certification chain, but the issuer field was blank. By 1902, I knew what it meant. Project Echo had not disappeared. They had finished what they began. The restoration was not a return of stolen funds. It was a rewriting of existence itself. The balance sheets now told a new truth, a truth no regulator could challenge because it was backed by flawless cryptographic proof. The system believed its own lie, and the lie was indistinguishable from fact. At 21:10, I walked through the empty corridors of the operations wing. The lights dimmed. Automatically behind me, the air smelled faintly of ozone from the cooling vents. I reached the archival vault and stood before the terminal that once held the ghost accounts. The interface displayed a perfect state. Every balance verified, every journal intact. The display pulsed quietly with the heartbeat of the system. Nothing out of order, nothing unexplained. I opened the internal memo folder one last time and read the closing line of the compliance summary. No crime, no loss, no incident. Closed, July 14th, 2019. Signed, Marcus Becker. And I realized that the system had achieved what Project Echo promised. Balance restored by erasing imbalance. The world would remember AlpenCredit not as a victim, but as a model of integrity. The shareholders would receive their dividends. The markets would reward stability. And yet, within that stability, there was an absence so deep, it hummed beneath the surface, like static under silence. The kind of silence that Project Echo had written about. Silence as the best way to steal sound. At 23:56, I closed my terminal. The building was nearly empty. I left my ID badge on the desk and walked toward the glass doors. The city lights shimmered across the river, the same as they always had. The difference was invisible to everyone but me. The 480 million had returned without a sender, without an origin, without a past. It was the perfect loop, a theft so complete it canceled its own existence. There would be no investigations, no confessions, no blame, only balance sheets in perfect order, a story that began nowhere and ended in precision. I looked back once through the glass and saw my reflection fractured across the polished surface of the lobby. And I thought of the first letter from Project Echo. We did not take a single euro. We only erased what should not have existed. And I understood. At last, they had been telling the truth. This was the robbery that never happened.